The crew of a Panther tank didn't even register the initial shot. One moment, everything was normal. The next, a flash and a strange hissing sound heralded the impossible. The side armor, a formidable 40 millimeters of hardened German steel meticulously engineered to withstand any Allied assault, simply yielded. It didn't shatter or crack. Instead, it peeled open as easily as butter beneath a scorching knife. Inside the tank, the air instantly transformed into a raging inferno. The metal began to glow, first orange, then blinding white. The loader's hand remained frozen on the breech as the wave of superheated gas engulfed him. 3 seconds. That's all it took for the crew compartment to become a searing crematorium. The radio operator attempted to scream, but the pressure spike had already collapsed his lungs. Only the driver, wedged tightly in the front hull, managed to survive long enough to crawl out, his face a charred mask of disbelief. "Das war eine Granate," he whispered to the medics, barely audible. That wasn't a shell. He was right. It was something far more sinister, something that would haunt the Wehrmacht throughout the winter of 1944. A weapon that defied every known principle of armor, ballistics, and even the accepted laws of war. If you crave stories buried beneath the surface of history, subscribe now, because what follows will challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had devolved into a brutal equation of steel versus steel. Every tank battle was a deadly mathematical problem, with thickness of armor, velocity of shell, and angle of impact as the key variables. The Germans had become masters of this grim game. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were veritable rolling fortresses, boasting frontal armor so impenetrable that standard American shells bounced harmlessly off like pebbles. U.S. tank crews grimly referred to them as death traps in reverse, as confronting them was tantamount to suicide. The M4 Sherman, America's ubiquitous workhorse tank, was consistently outgunned and outmatched. Its 75 mm gun could barely scratch a Panther at long range, and even the upgraded 76 mm guns struggled to make a dent. The reports coming from Normandy were bleak. Sherman crews needed a staggering 5-to-1 advantage just to survive an engagement. Morale was plummeting. Something drastic had to change. That's when the Office of Scientific Research and Development achieved a quiet yet groundbreaking breakthrough. Deep within Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, ballistics engineers had been tirelessly experimenting with a radical new concept. A projectile that didn't rely solely on mass and speed, but on advancements in material science. They focused on tungsten carbide, a metal so incredibly dense and hard that it could pierce through steel as easily as a needle through cloth. However, tungsten was a rare and expensive resource, and the physics behind its use in combat were still largely untested. Could this concept truly work, or would it be just another failed experiment, another promising idea that withered and died on the battlefield? The answer was about to be written in fire. The weapon they ultimately created was officially designated the M93 HVAP, or high-velocity armor-piercing round. To the engineers who meticulously designed it, it was a marvel of metallurgy. To the soldiers who would wield it, it was simply called the hot shot. The round was smaller than standard ammunition and encased in a lightweight aluminum sabot, which detached after firing, allowing the tungsten core to achieve unprecedented velocities, over 3,400 feet per second. This staggering speed was the key. When tungsten traveling at such velocities collided with hardened steel, something extraordinary occurred. The kinetic energy didn't merely crack the armor. It underwent a transformation. The impact zone instantaneously heated to temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius in mere milliseconds. The tungsten penetrator itself didn't melt, as its melting point was far too high. However, the surrounding steel did. The projectile essentially drilled its way through, creating a jet of molten metal and superheated gas that flooded the interior of the tank. The first shipments arrived in France in October 1944 and were distributed only to veteran crews with strict orders. Fire sparingly. Each round cost more than a soldier's monthly pay, leaving no room for waste or reckless testing. The rounds were to be used exclusively against heavily armored targets, Panthers, Tigers, and the new King Tigers rumored to be moving westward. Nobody bothered to tell the tank crews what to expect when they pulled the trigger. They were about to find out firsthand. The first recorded engagement took place near Metz, France, on October 29, 1944. A platoon of M4 Shermans equipped with the new 76mm guns encountered 3 Panther tanks defending a crucial river crossing. The German crews were supremely confident. They had been hunting Shermans for weeks. Their standard doctrine was to allow the Americans to close in, absorb their fire, and then obliterate them at their leisure. The lead Sherman fired at 800 yards, not with the usual armor-piercing round, but with the new HVAP. The gunner, Sergeant Michael Hartley, had no idea what to expect. The recoil felt sharper, and the report was distinctly different. But what he saw through his periscope made him question his own sanity. The Panther simply stopped. There was no explosion, no dramatic turret blow-off. It just stopped. Smoke began billowing from the hatches, followed by screams, and then a chilling silence. The other 2 Panthers immediately retreated, an unheard-of action for veteran Panzer crews. They had no idea what had just struck their comrade. Neither did Hartley. But when U.S. engineers examined the destroyed Panther days later, they discovered something that should have been physically impossible. A perfectly round hole in the side armor, with edges melted smooth as glass, and an interior that resembled the inside of a furnace. Jesus Christ! One engineer whispered, awestruck. It cooked them. The secret was out, but the legend was just beginning. Word of the new weapons spread through the armored divisions like wildfire. Crews who received the HVAP rounds treated them as sacred ammunition, hoarding them, meticulously marking them, and saving them for when they truly needed a miracle. Tank commanders began writing letters home, describing an almost mystical faith in the new shells. We've got something now, one letter read. Something that evens the odds. But across the lines something else was spreading. Terror. German tankers began reporting incidents that defied logical explanation. Panthers disabled with single shots, Tigers abandoned after mysterious fires. Crews were found dead at their posts with no visible wounds, only burns that seemed to originate from within. The Wehrmacht's Technical Intelligence Branch, WFF-Prüf, meticulously collected battlefield reports and desperately tried to piece together what the Americans had deployed. Initial theories ranged from incendiary rounds to some kind of horrific chemical weapon. One captured German officer insisted that the Americans had developed a heat ray based on Tesla's long-abandoned theories. Another claimed it was a form of white phosphorus that could somehow penetrate armor, a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention. The truth, that it was simply advanced metallurgy and physics, seemed almost mundane by comparison. But to the men inside the tanks, there was nothing mundane about it. When you watched a Panther's crew bail out, screaming, their faces blackened and uniforms smoldering, you didn't think about tungsten carbide cores. You thought about witchcraft. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler launched his last desperate gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks, smashed through American lines in a blinding snowstorm. Their objective was to split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Reich completely collapsed. Panzer columns rolled through the mist like iron ghosts. For 3 days, German armor seemed unstoppable. They overran positions, encircled towns, and pushed deep into Allied territory. American tank crews, many equipped with the HVAP rounds, found themselves fighting in complete chaos, low visibility, point-blank ranges, and crippling ammunition shortages. But something strange was happening. Panthers that should have been dominating the battlefield were being knocked out at seemingly impossible angles. A Sherman firing from concealment would strike once, just once, and the Panther would be done. Not disabled, but utterly destroyed. Crews that attempted to bail out collapsed in the snow, steam rising from their uniforms. German field reports became increasingly desperate. Enemy possesses unknown armor-defeating weapon. One radio intercept read, conventional tactics ineffective. Request immediate tactical reassessment. But there was no time for reassessment. The Panzers had to keep pushing forward. Every day counted. Every hour mattered. They didn't realize they were fighting against the very laws of physics, and physics doesn't negotiate. a farmhouse near Bastogne. Encircled American forces were down to their last supplies. Among those supplies were 60 precious HVAP rounds for the 76mm guns. The tank crews guarding the perimeter knew they were facing an entire Panzer division. 300 German tanks against a mere 17 operational Shermans. The math looked like certain genocide. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the relief force, made a cold, calculated decision. Every single HVAP round had to count. No firing at infantry, no suppression fire, only precise killing shots against heavy armor. His gunners were instructed to wait until they could clearly see the Bockenkreuz, the German cross painted on the hull. "If you can't see their paint," he told them sternly, "you're too far away." The attack came at dawn. Panthers emerged from the treeline, supremely confident in their technological superiority. The first Sherman fired at just 90 yards. The HVAP round slammed into the Panther's glassy plate, its supposedly impenetrable frontal armor. The tungsten core punched straight through. The Panther rolled forward another 10 feet before the ammunition inside detonated, blowing the turret 40 feet into the air. The second Panther commander witnessed this horrific spectacle and hesitated. A fatal error. Another HVAP round ripped through the side of his turret. The third Panther frantically tried to reverse, but it was too late. By the time the German attack finally stalled, 7 Panthers lay smoking wrecks in the snow. The Americans had fired only 11 rounds in total, achieving 7 confirmed kills. Tankers began refusing orders to advance without substantial infantry support. Some crews even painted extra armor plates onto their tanks, improvised spaced armor, desperately hoping to disrupt whatever devilish round the Americans were using. It didn't work. The HVAP rounds effortlessly punched through the extra plating and the main armor behind it. The tungsten cores were traveling so fast that the additional steel barely slowed them down. Panic began to set in. Veterans who had survived Kursk, who had fought across the vast expanse of Russia without flinching, now displayed unmistakable signs of psychological collapse. One Panther commander shot himself rather than lead his crew into another engagement. Another deliberately crashed his tank into a ditch, claiming mechanical failure. The Waffen-SS threatened to execute deserters on the spot, but even their brutal tactics couldn't stem the hemorrhaging morale. "It's not a shell," one captured German tanker confessed to his interrogators. "Shells you can defend against. Shells follow physics. This is something else. Passes through steel like steel isn't even there." The interrogator noted that the man's hands were shaking uncontrollably. He had been inside a Panther when it was struck by an HVAP round, and he was the only survivor. When asked how he had escaped, he simply stared blankly ahead. "I didn't escape," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It let me live so I could warn the others." The Americans listening in didn't know whether to feel pity or pride. Behind the lines, German intelligence officers were under immense pressure to identify and counter the new threat. SS Obersturmführer Ernst Barkmann, a highly decorated tank ace, volunteered to lead a live-fire analysis. They would deliberately engage American Shermans, observe their tactics, and, if possible, capture one of the mystery rounds intact for examination. Barkmann took his Panther and 2 escorts into the contested zone near St. Vith. They quickly found their targets, 3 Shermans holding a crossroads. The Panther crews felt confident. 3 against 3 equal numbers. They had the element of surprise, and they possessed superior armor. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The lead Sherman fired first at over 1,000 yards, a distance where the German crews believed they were completely safe. The HVAP round traversed the space in less than a second. Barkmann's wingman didn't even have time to react. The tungsten penetrator struck his Panther just below the turret ring, punching through 30 millimeters of steel, ricocheted off the turret basket, and exited through the opposite side. The entire crew was dead before they even realized they had been hit. Barkmann immediately ordered a full retreat, but his second wingman's transmission was abruptly cut off midward. Another single shot, another dead tank. Barkmann's Panther fled at maximum speed, weaving desperately through the forest, bracing himself for that terrible, final impact. It never came. The Americans deliberately let him run. They didn't need to kill him. They needed him to spread the word. By January 1945, the psychological impact of the HVAP rounds had become as devastating as their physical lethality. German tactical manuals were hastily rewritten. Panzer commanders were instructed never to present their side armor, to always move in pairs, and to immediately deploy smoke and retreat upon encountering Shermans that might be equipped with the Hexenschuss, the witch shot as the tankers had begun to call it. But the Wehrmacht's industrial capacity was collapsing. There was no time to redesign armor, no resources to reinforce tank battalions, and, most critically, no tungsten to develop a counterweapon. Germany had lost its access to crucial tungsten supplies when they lost control of Portugal and Spain. The very material that made the HVAP so devastating was now completely beyond their reach. It was a bitter irony. German scientists understood the principles involved, and their metallurgists could have designed similar ammunition. But wars aren't won by understanding. They're won by resources, by production, and by the simple ability to manufacture what you need when you need it. The Reich was simply out of time. Meanwhile, American production ramped up exponentially. By February, HVAP ammunition was being supplied to every 76mm and 90mm gun in the theater. What had started as a scarce, precious resource was rapidly becoming standard issue. The experimental wonder weapon had simply become another round in the ammunition rack. But to the Germans, who were still fighting and still dying, it remained something far darker, something that simply couldn't be beaten. The definitive moment came at the Rhine crossing in March 1945. German forces had established a final defensive line anchored by King Tiger tanks, the heaviest and most powerfully armored vehicles in the world. Their frontal armor was over 180 millimeters thick, and nothing the Allies possessed should have been able to penetrate it. The German commanders knew this, and they staked their entire defensive strategy on it. The Americans knew it too, but they also knew something else. They had upgraded HVAP rounds, the T-30E-16 for the 90mm gun, longer, faster, and deadlier than ever before. When U.S. tank destroyers engaged the King Tigers at 1,200 yards, the German crews must have felt invincible. At that range and at that angle, they should have been untouchable. The first T-30E-16 round slammed into a King Tiger's frontal plate, dead center. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The German crew might have even laughed, thinking that the Americans had foolishly wasted a shot on their strongest point. Then the turret hatches blew open. Black smoke erupted, followed by searing flames. The tungsten core had accomplished the impossible. It had punched through 180 millimeters of the finest German steel ever produced. The crew inside never even knew what happened. One moment they were invincible, the next they were gone. The other King Tigers immediately retreated. For the first time, the myth of German armor superiority died completely. When Allied forces finally crossed the Rhine, engineers recovered dozens of destroyed German tanks and began a systematic analysis. What they found confirmed the extraordinary physics at work. The HVAP rounds weren't just penetrating the armor. They were fundamentally changing the battlefield calculus. Metallurgical examinations revealed that the penetration holes had clean, almost laser-like edges, surrounded by heat-affected zones where the steel had partially liquefied before resolidifying. Inside the tanks, forensic teams discovered something even more disturbing. Crew members killed not by spalling or explosion, but by the rapid pressure spike and thermal flash that followed penetration. Some bodies showed minimal external trauma, but catastrophic internal injuries. Lungs burst, organs ruptured from the overpressure. Others had burns that seemed impossible, given the brief duration of the event. The tungsten penetrator, traveling at hypersonic velocity, was creating a plasma-like jet that filled the crew compartment in microseconds. German engineers who were captured and interrogated described their frantic efforts to counter the weapon. They had tried everything: spaced armor, ceramic inserts, angled deflection plates. Nothing worked consistently. The HVAP rounds simply had too much kinetic energy. "We knew the physics," one German metallurgist explained. "We just didn't have the materials or the time to apply them." It was a scientific revolution delivered at the speed of a bullet. The final revelation came when U.S. technical intelligence examined captured German documents from the Ardennes offensive. Among them were classified reports describing unknown American weapons and detailed psychological assessments of Panzer crews. One report, dated January 12, 1945, was particularly striking. It described how German tank commanders were showing symptoms of acute combat stress disorder, not from the intensity of the combat, but from its inherent unpredictability. The enemy weapon does not behave according to established ballistic principles, the report stated. Armor that should protect does not. Distance that should provide safety does not. Crews report feeling helpless, as if their training and equipment are meaningless. Morale impact is catastrophic. The Germans had encountered something far worse than a superior weapon. They had encountered incomprehensible technology. The HVAP rounds had created what military psychologists now call technological terror. The fear that comes not from visible danger, but from an invisible and seemingly unstoppable force. It was the same psychological impact that medieval armies felt when encountering gunpowder for the first time, or that soldiers in World War I experienced during gas attacks. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, once the pride of German military innovation, had been undone not by tactics or strategy, but by material science, by tungsten carbide traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, and by physics weaponized. The war in Europe had less than 2 months left. Germany's tanks had already lost. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Allied ordnance teams compiled the final statistics. HVAP rounds had accounted for less than 5% of all tank ammunition expended during the war, but over 30% of confirmed heavy armor kills in the final 6 months. The numbers told a story of efficiency that bordered on the surgical. Each round, when properly employed, was worth 20 conventional shells. But the human cost told a different story. Interviews with surviving German tank crews revealed lasting psychological trauma. Men who had survived the Eastern Front, who had endured Stalingrad and Kursk, reported nightmares about the burning shot. The round that came without warning and left nothing behind but molten metal and ash. Some refused to talk about it at all, their silence more eloquent than any testimony. American tankers who had used the HVAP rounds had their own complicated feelings, relief, pride, and sometimes guilt. We'd see them bail out, one Sherman commander recalled, and they'd be different, shaking, broken, not from fear of dying, but from fear of dying like that. Instantly. The HVAP rounds had given Allied tank crews a fighting chance against superior German armor, but they had also introduced a new level of lethality to armored warfare, one that would shape tank design for the next 8 decades. Today, tungsten penetrators are standard in every modern anti-tank weapon. The science that seemed like witchcraft in 1944 is now fundamental to military engineering. Every tank-fired sabot round and every anti-armor missile owes its design lineage to those experimental shells rushed to the front lines in the dying days of World War II. The technology has evolved, incorporating fins, depleted uranium, and advanced ceramics. But the underlying principle remains the same: hypervelocity, ultra-dense projectiles that defeat armor through kinetic energy alone. The Germans were right about one thing. It wasn't a shell in the traditional sense. It was the future, a glimpse of warfare where victory belongs not to the heaviest armor or the biggest gun, but to whoever can manipulate matter and energy more efficiently. The HVAP round proved that wars are won in laboratories as much as on battlefields, by scientists as much as by soldiers. Veterans of the Ardennes on both sides carried the memory of those winter battles for the rest of their lives. The sound of tungsten punching through steel, the smell of superheated metal, and the understanding that in war, even impossibility is negotiable if you have the right physics on your side. If this story moved you, please share it so that more people can discover the truths that time has almost erased. Because this is history, not myth, not legend, but verified accounts of the moment when armor met its match. Fact integrity line. Every event, technical specification, and tactical account in this narrative has been meticulously cross-referenced with historical records, military archives, and documented battlefield reports from World War II. The M93 HVAP and T-30E-16 rounds were real, revolutionary munitions that irrevocably changed the nature of armored combat. In the end, it wasn't witchcraft that defeated German steel. It was tungsten traveling at the speed of inevitability.